What do we talk about during the breaks? Do we talk about integrated services? Do we talk about collaborative work practices? Do we talk about holistic client-centered systems? Or do we talk about our work? And I suppose my interest today in speaking about collaboration is to talk about the forgotten warriors of community change. You, right? We can talk about systems, we can talk about collaborations, we can talk about children and young people, but in the end, everything hinges upon us. And this morning we had a lovely presentation about models and the need for changing models and so on, but it seems to me that we've got to talk about the mess, not just the models. The models can provide direction, but in the end, it's the mess that we have to deal with. You know, the most stunning thing that I heard this morning was not the models, it was the mess of 500 people losing their jobs. That's you. That's me. We're losing our jobs all over the place. That's going to have direct implications for how we carry out what we do. And so today, I want to talk about the people who work with young people rather than children and young people as such, because everything hinges upon you. But I'm not going to talk about everybody who works with young people because we'd be here far too long. We could talk about teachers, we could talk about nurses, we could talk about social workers, we could talk about youth workers and so on. What I'd like to do today is concentrate on youth workers as an example of the type of analysis that we need to undertake if we're truly going to talk about collaborations. Basically, I want to talk about the nature of youth work. I want to talk about youth services and the idea of collaborations. I want to talk about youth work in schools as an example of collaboration. And I want to conclude today by talking about the real issues that we're all confronting, and that whilst we talk rhetorically about the importance of collaboration, in the end it's all a question of resources, and it's about jobs. And so we've got to talk about realistically what we're facing, and when we look over the horizon into the future, that horizon's here today. Again, the most striking thing that I heard this morning in the presentation was the brief mention of 500 jobs being lost to DHS. And I thought, well, actually that should be at the front of our concern, not simply off to the side. Okay, like I said, we could talk here about many different groups that work with young people, with children and young people. I'm just going to use youth work as one example. But let's be clear that youth work has been around a long time, at least 150 years. Youth workers' mandate historically has always been to go with change, the social changes, and to respond and react to the social changes in society in a variety of different forms and formats and guises. And the politics of youth work has shifted dramatically over that 150 years as well. But let's be aware that youth work, and look at the issues. The issues are not new issues, right? These are we can look and read Charles Dickens and get a sense that there ain't nothing new with a lot of the stuff that we're dealing with. So let's be aware of the history, and also, I think, be proud of the history of youth work intervention over that last period of time. Let's also be aware of the incredible diversity of youth work. And if you look at the diverse types of youth work, it also should sensitize us to the fact that there are amazing skills that have to be drawn upon to be a good professional youth worker. We are working across many different types of issues, social problems, and institutions. And I think, again, a partial list just gives you some idea of the different places within which youth workers are already working. Collaboration has always been on the agenda for youth workers. It's part of the nature of youth work itself. Of course, not every youth worker works the same way. There are different and diverse politics of youth work. We've got your conservatives through to your commos, right? You've got your radicals, you've got your middle-of-the-road liberals, and so on. So, of course, and like with teachers and with nurses, you're going to have diversity of politics of teaching and of health provision and so on. So we need to be aware of some of those differences. We also know that historically, youth work has changed institutionally from sort of a charity type of focus. And by the time we get into the 1970s, it's more we have concepts like empowerment and a different focus of youth work. And we have concepts relating to pro-social training of a variety of different kinds. And we have advocacy work, again, with and for young people. And of course, again, that notion of empowerment. So the history of youth work is also a history of modification and changing politics, but be aware that the politics within youth work is variable as well. And I do want to make the point that likewise, if we're going to talk about nursing, teaching, doctoring, or whatever, you're going to find those kinds of political differences as well. However, in the end, I think we can identify certain key attributes of youth workers that makes youth work. Because otherwise, if you just say everybody who works with young people is a youth worker, then there is no such thing as youth work. And so some of the key attributes, regardless of your politics or where you work, include things like self-identification as a youth worker. I'm a youth worker, not a counselor. I'm a youth worker, not a social worker, and so on. So it's, in part, it's a negative definition, but it's also a positive definition because it says the young people come first. They are the center of the practice. So there are certain attributes of youth work, including a commitment to work in defense of the rights and interests of young people. And those interests and rights are, again, defined often differently depending on the nature of the youth worker. So you can define it in terms of the best interests of the child, so the Convention on the Rights of the Child definition, or the youth, you might look at youth as a subject for empowerment, or youth as victims. So there's different conceptions, but nevertheless, it is working in the interests of the young people themselves. And of course, there are different political projects that underpin the way in which we work with young people. We want to stop the riots that happened in Cronulla or in the UK, and that could be just from the point of view of social stability. Or we want to say, let's foster the political engagement of young people so that we go beyond riots into some kind of substantive political change and transformation. So there's a different politics that can underpin. But nevertheless, these are some of the key attributes of youth work. But what we do, of course, is grounded in the realities of working with real, live human beings. And so there's always that sense of pragmatism and situational ethics that pertain to the nature of youth work itself. Pragmatic politics. If you're dealing with young people, if the person's got a drug addiction problem, you don't sit there and say, well, I'm going to try and personally empower you. You work with the problem, and then you can move on to the next thing. It's pragmatic, the intervention. Or situational ethics means that depending on the situation and the person and the issue, you'll respond differently. As I said here in the example, sometimes it's the young people who know what is best. Sometimes they don't. And sometimes they have wisdom beyond their years, but it's situationally defined. So there's no one-size-fits-all. It very much depends upon the situation. We also have different strategic uses of youth as a concept. We need money for our projects. We need to fund our projects. And so we will talk about youth in different strategic ways in order to get the money. And if the latest rhetoric in terms of getting money is vulnerability, then we'll talk about our charges as being vulnerable, if that's the way to get money. Or if it's youth gangs, or youth as victims, or if it's about colonialism, or we want it to build future leaders and so on. So be aware that we do this, because that's the nature of the game. It's a funding game. It's an important process as long as we're self-conscious about what we're trying to achieve in using youth strategically in this way. And of course, youth work is inherently intersectoral. It involves working collaboratively across institutions, schools, police, shelters, distinct areas of work, welfare, work itself, that is employment for young people, and health and so on, and across different agendas, immediate relief and political economic reform and so on. So, that's youth workers. But youth workers ostensibly are there to provide a service. By and large, within a youth work framework, service provision takes into account this idea of the whole person. I want you to keep this in mind, this idea of the whole person, that we experience life as a whole person, not as a bundle of needs. Now, I want you to keep that in mind later because I'm going to talk about workers, because they're whole people too. But is that acknowledged in our workplaces, in our work practices? And that's a question I'll return to. Community-centered in terms of people power and connecting, and of course the rights of the child, which aren't only about institutional obligations to children and young people, but also the capacity and ability to operate and interact with young people on the basis of respect. So it's not simply about institutional obligations. Human rights is also about operating with respect. The dynamics of youth service provision will vary greatly. Again, trying to give you a sense of the field, we have youth-specific institutions. In some of these, we should break them down, I would argue. For example, schools. A lot of schools are empty at night or on the weekends, at least where I live. I'm in Tasmania. And I think, what a waste of a fantastic community resource. We've got the facility. And where I've seen programs that integrate back into community activities in schools, it's amazing the difference it makes in the local community. But we have youth-specific services. We have youth. If we want to analyze, we can also analyze services not in terms of youth-specific, that is, those designed specifically for the young people and children, but also we can talk about whether they're youth-friendly. I won't dwell on this, but there was a wonderful project in Melton a number of years ago where the young people in the area went around and they did a survey by going into the retail shops, going into the local banks, going into the Centrelink office and so on, and they rated how they were treated. And one of them had a mohawk, and so they made sure that he got in there in different places. They go in groups, they go in individually, and they did this survey of the Melton area, the CBD area of Melton, and then they rated them, and then they awarded the local frock shop or the retail or the cafe, the restaurant, they gave them awards if they were youth-friendly. And I thought that's pretty cool, because most of the time, it's all about how anti-youth the institutions are. And this was young people themselves taking the initiative to let the public know what places they felt safest and where they felt welcomed. Service provision and youth experiences are going to vary, though. Sometimes the service provision itself can be seen as reinforcing a problem. Unfortunately, child protection is one of those areas for a whole range of reasons. But it could be the lack of service provision as well that's the problem. So it's not simply having a service, it's the nature of the service and the dynamics that underpin the service that we have to look at. We have to look at service provision in terms of different kinds of roles that our services can play. As social connectors, linking and bringing people together. As social includers, that is, having programs that can bring people together in a meaningful way. And of course, having groups form on the basis of our services and programs. So what we want to do is get people together in a positive, meaningful, purposive way, because that's where meaning comes. If we're working with others, I'm not going to get into the discussion of jargon and language, except to say that collaboration itself is a loaded term, as are terms like case management and so on, because they mean different things to different people. One of the more useful definitions of collaboration that I've seen is this one. And basically, if you start at the bottom, collaboration, what makes collaboration is the conjunction of the elements on top. So networking, that is exchange of information, plus altering activities for a common purpose, plus sharing resources, plus enhancing the capacity of other partners for mutual benefit equals collaboration. So collaboration can be seen as, in fact, a fairly sophisticated concept. It's not simply picking up the phone and having a chat with somebody and you're saying, oh, I'm collaborating. It's a lot more complex and sophisticated than that, which is really important, actually. There are different types of collaboration as well. As we'll see in a moment when we get to schools, you're not just talking about collaboration between teachers and social workers or teachers and youth workers and so on. You're talking about vertical collaboration that's necessary, that is the mission within the institution itself. So you have to make sure that your principals, your teachers, your coaches and so on are on the same page so that they're collaborating together in that sort of institutional collaboration. But then cutting across it, it's going to be collaborations by teachers, counselors, social workers, youth workers and so on. So there's different kinds of collaboration. I'm not going to go into a big thing about collaboration, but just trying to, again, emphasize the point that collaboration, in fact, is a very sophisticated process involving many different players and elements. You don't want to hear about the benefits of collaboration. There's benefits. But basically, we have to feed the workers. But one of the questions, certainly if you're going to talk about service provision, has to be to evaluate our own practice. And what criteria are we going to use to evaluate our own practice? What do services and youth workers do well? What do we do poorly? And I think that's a useful, but we should do that in a non-threatening way, but that's the kind of reflective activity. But also, what qualities do young people like or find most effective in youth workers? So it's not simply about effectiveness. It's identifying the qualities that make good practice. If you want to, if we take up the last slide or second last slide of the previous presentation, it says, do your work well. Now, if we're going to take that seriously, then we have to identify what do we mean by doing our work well. So we have to come up with some strategic criteria for that. I want to move now to the third part of the presentation, which is actually talking about collaboration in practice. And the example I'm using today is schools. And basically, we want to know things like what brings people together, what resources are there to bring people together, under what basis are we bringing people together, and so on. And importantly, how do we translate all this scholarly, academic, theoretical, abstract stuff about collaboration and professional engagement and so on into practice in a way that makes sense to you guys, in a way that makes sense to all of us at a very applied, practical level. And to me, that's one of the key questions. We can have the models, but how do we deal with the mess? Key question. Certainly we have heard this morning, and I think it's a useful perspective, the idea of place-based policy. That is, go to where people are at. Go to the local levels and go and suss out the local resources and see what local services are available and pitch the engagement and the service provision at the local level. And that's part of the DHS change management strategy, and I think that that's a very useful perspective. That's certainly one that Joanna Wynne and myself are advocating as well. Schools are important, of course, because they're a place of social connection. In work that we've done in the past, what we found is that often unemployed young people who had left school were coming back to the school to hang out because even though they weren't at school, it was a place where they could connect with their mates. So schools are really important as a place of social connection. And of course, in partnership, it may be possible to provide the support, advice, and facilitation that young people who are at risk of being marginalized need. And this can include, for example, the role of youth workers in schools. And of course, we want to talk not only about at-risk young people and vulnerable young people and so on, but we want to talk about strengths. We want to talk about capacities and build on the strengths and capacities of individuals and communities. If we're going to talk about collaboration, then it means that people who are involved in a collaborative process also have to have certain competencies in the undertaking of collaborative work. These include things like knowing the boundaries of trust, accountability, and responsibility in relation to each person's position. A teacher has a different relationship in the school than a youth worker, who's different to a counselor, and a welfare officer who's different from a social worker and to a principal, and so on. So we have to have that understanding that we're actually doing different things, and we can't necessarily be in each other's headspace, but we have to appreciate the position different people have. We can also, if you're going to collaborate, don't just talk, organize it around task-specific purposes. Otherwise, it's a talk fest. And you build good relationships with people by working with people on specific tasks. And jargon. We all use jargon in varying ways, but it's really interesting. The more you unpack jargon, the more you realize that, for example, a partnership in a health center context between nurses and doctors is a very different concept of partnership than between teachers and social workers. We use words differently. We might have different words. Or we might have the same phrase. Case management is one that I use a lot in criminology, but it's used so radically differently depending on whether you're talking to correctional officers or whether you're talking to the integrated offender management team. So the jargon, the words, we have to decipher the different meanings, and we could be talking past each other without realizing it sometimes as well. So these are part of the competencies that we need to develop if we're to work with other people. We have to acknowledge, as I've indicated earlier, that teachers and youth workers and social workers and so on are actually located quite differently in terms of the law and in terms of the institution in relation to what they do and the kinds of relationships that they can form with young people and children. Teachers have certain statutory and occupational and institutional obligations that may differ at varying points to those of social workers and youth workers and so on. And that can sometimes lead to friction. And indeed, in some of the work that we've done in Tasmania, there is a big blue between social workers and teachers. And the blue was basically based on the idea that the teachers were miffed because the social workers seemed to be so casual, and they could just leave any time, and it was a different culture and a different kind of work situation, and the teachers were getting snarky because they saw that the social workers, no kidding, like they'd leave the school grounds during school hours, this kind of stuff, and the social workers are going, what's wrong with these bloody teachers? We're just trying to help these kids. We have to do certain things. So there's actually friction, so that in fact we were called in by the education department to do, myself and a social worker, to do some work with social workers who were working in schools to try and identify what the conflict and frictions were. And what we discovered is that there's different occupational expectations and spaces. And likewise, in the work that Tim Corney and others have done on youth workers in schools, we do know that there are occasional clashes between youth workers and teachers in a similar kind of vein. So if we're going to work collaboratively at the schools level, let's be aware that we actually are in different occupational spaces. We have to acknowledge and recognize that and work around it. Now, the interesting thing, though, is that we don't want to stereotype too much youth workers, social workers, counselors, and so on, because often each professional grouping may be concerned with the education, welfare, and empowerment of the young people who they often see as the most important thing in terms of their workplace practice. So often the teachers, social workers, youth workers, and so on actually have the same kind of orientation, but not always. Different workers, different missions. Again, I'm not going to dwell on this slide, but basically it makes the point that I've just made, that we are positioned differently depending upon our formal occupational role within the school. In some cases, we might have more autonomy. If I'm a social worker, I have certain legal powers. That means that I can retain confidentiality, client confidentiality. If I'm a youth worker, I ain't got that legal protection. So there are important differences between different classes and types of workers. Accountability might be, in the case of a teacher, more to the school principal, but for a social worker, it might be to the professional association, which carries some weight in terms of ethics and official accreditation of that youth worker. The work structuring is quite different. Teachers, in part, going to be driven by the timetable and being on campus. However, social workers and youth workers who work in schools are going to may spend time off campus and not be driven by that timetable, because they might have to do out of school hours work to work with that young person and their family and so on. So these are significant differences that can create problems in terms of collaboration. However, they can all be overcome. But this is a case of youth work in schools in Queensland. As Taylor points out, as an employee of a community agency, a youth support coordinator has greater flexibility than do school-based welfare staff. They can conduct case management work beyond school hours and beyond the school gate. Again, crystallizing a little bit of what I've been saying about the differences in work situation and occupational place for the different people who work with young people within a school setting. So the point of this big long slide, which I'm going to do that too, is basically that we've got to work across disciplines. Now, one of the better pieces of advice on this, again, is provided by Taylor in their work in Queensland, that we have to actually understand what each person does within the school setting. If you're going to collaborate, they need to mutually value these contributions. A teacher's doing great work if they're doing it well, and a youth worker's doing great work if they're doing it well, but we have to appreciate the different kinds of contributions and being able to evaluate how best to maximize those contributions within that particular work setting. Actually, I put this in because I thought I think Phil Crane's at the conference. So he's recently published something in Youth Studies Australia about joined-up practice. And I thought it's a very useful article that deals with some principles of dealing with at-risk young people, but I thought the principles were quite useful from the point of view of collaboration. So by all means, get the latest issue of Youth Studies Australia. I am the director of the Australian Clearinghouse for Youth Studies that publishes Youth Studies Australia, but Phil's got a great article in there. Now, let's get to the crunch. This is the last part before we go to lunch. And in some ways, this is the most difficult part. What is the context within which we're trying to do our work? And the context is ideologically a context of neoliberalism, where all the focus is on individualism. It's about do-it-yourself, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, et cetera, and it is an ideological climate that is not about the social. It's about the individual, and it's very much individualism which is stressed. It is not simply an ideological climate, of course, because it's also a certain type of economic climate. And we haven't even gone into the next phase. And it's a climate of austerity. And it's a climate of broken budgets and doing it cheap. And this is happening, certainly, we know, in Europe. It's happening in the United States, and it is going to get worse in places like Australia. This is our context. Within that context, we can ask major questions about how we as workers are being treated. I work within the university sector, and I'll tell you right now, we are not valued. We are being told that we have to produce, and we have to be researchers who produce, and the metrics are being put into place, and our jobs are being cut, and basically, they don't care. And what it translates into, for those who work with young people, is that your caseloads are going to increase, not decrease. And there's going to be a whole series of performance metrics about stuff that they can measure, because they want to be able to measure performance in concrete, measurable ways that may, in fact, put more pressure on you as workers. And I'm always, how we always try and be so holistic in terms of how we deal with children and young people, but when it comes to us, they don't want a holistic approach. They don't want to know if you've got kids or sick kids, or you need a day off, or you need a mental health day, or whatever. They just want to know, are you producing? I don't think I'm being too cynical on this. The reason why I asked at the beginning, what do you talk about in the breaks, is because quite often, if you go to any professional conference these days, it's often about how difficult it is at the coalface. And I think we should acknowledge that. And we should make that part of the problem that we collectively need to address. That implies certain challenges. The challenges including, for example, are we achieving social justice or just holding the line? Some of us still have that vision of social justice, that we work in these sectors, we do what we do because there's a vision of what could be. And yet so often what we end up doing is just holding the line. Working condition. Who wants to be a frontline warrior of social renovation and community change if stress, for me, personally, is the main outcome? Because that stress impacts upon me, my family, my kids, my relatives, my neighborhood. So what are the costs of trying to do the right thing? The precariat. You ever heard that expression? It's the proletariat combined with precariousness. And you combine them and you have the precariat. That is, people who have uneven job prospects, it's job insecurity. We heard this morning about jobless families, jobless neighborhoods, but often what we've got is part job here, insecurity here. I'm going to compete with your agency next week, because somebody's got to get the money to pay for me to eat on my low wage. So precariousness has to be taken into account. And the question I have here is, yes, okay, for some it's bad now, but it ain't going to get better. So what are we collectively going to do about this? Three things that I hear most when I go to professional conferences: workloads, number of cases, or working with young people who demand more intensive service provision. So it's not simply your caseload that's increasing, it's the complexity of the young people we're dealing with, and issues of comorbidity, of mental health, mental illness, homelessness, joblessness, juvenile delinquency, and so on. So it's the complexity. It's not simply just the caseload itself. Workplace support, high staff turnover. And that, again, is going to be increasing as the workforce in general gets older. There's a number of us are going to retire, maybe, in the next couple of years. The workforce is graying. And there's going to be turnovers. And that's going to have implications in terms of corporate memory, in terms of workplace practices. I was hearing some sessions this morning that I heard 25 years ago, almost word for word. And how do we retain the knowledge from the past into the future? And of course, fewer professional development opportunities. What gets cut when budgets get cut? Your training. Coming to a conference like this. That's what's going to get cut. Oh, it's not that important. Are you really? It's really important, because that's where you meet other people. You can moan and groan, but you're not only moaning and groaning, you're learning from other people. You're learning tactics and strategies of how to do your job, of how to negotiate with your committees, how to do stuff in your community, and so on. So that professional development is ultimately hugely important. And of course, the third area is workplace dynamics. Low morale and high stress. And these are issues that are perennial that we have to try and come to grips with. If we're going to talk about collaboration seriously, then we got to talk about this stuff. Is collaboration and the pressures to collaborate going to increase the pressures, or is it going to decrease the pressures? Is there a way that we can think through collaboration in a really productive way, or are we just going to get stressed by the whole thought? In terms of youth work, specifically, there's a number of pressures. There's issues pertaining to the levels of resources available to governments in the face of both austerity budgets, where people are cutting like crazy, 500 from DHS, couldn't believe that. You talk to the federal people, and of course, they're getting uniform cuts right across that's going to affect things like the Office for Youth and so on. So the cuts, but also climate change. We haven't even discussed that yet. We don't have, this is what you can discuss over lunch maybe, but climate change is going to have a direct impact on all of the work that we do. And the kind of impact is this. You know, there was those floods in Queensland last year? Well, the floods had to be responded to in some way, so they took money out of the housing budget that was affecting homeless young people and put it into the disaster relief budget so that they could house the people who'd lost their houses during the Queensland floods. So climate change and disaster also has an impact upon potential resources. We have to start thinking about this stuff really seriously. There are issues of increasing workloads and the emphasis on crisis care. So we want to work holistically. We want to take a long-term way of working with these young people and map it out and so on. But if your caseload gets too big, then what you end up doing is crisis care rather than the more longer-term oriented type of intervention. Let's talk about pre-service and in-service training and the devaluing of specifically youth work education. We know in Victoria that there was some controversy over the youth work program and how it's located and being resourced at RMIT. We know that the youth work program in Scotland by our Aussie comrade Howard Sercombe, that was at threat of being cut. So if we're truly going to value working with young people, then we have to defend our professional training and education of youth work, and that extends across the board to other similar types of professional groups. Also, are we going to end up talking about issues in the here and now because that's all we're resourced to do, and what happened to the old politics of transformation? How do we change the society so it's better? What we're doing is picking up the pieces. And unfortunately, a lot of youth work historically in the last 150 years has been picking up the pieces. When do we go into the agenda of transformation? And we have some examples of potential transformative politics. We've seen it through the Arab Spring. And I think we can learn a lot by studying where transformation around the world is happening, because we can apply some of the lessons of that back here in Australia. And I want to finish briefly by not talking about those questions. Instead, I just want to simply say this, that if those who work with young people are at the front line of social renovation and community change, then we must value and cherish and pay and treat respectfully those who work with young people. Thank you.